I can see everything from here. Her voice was a low hum against the 4 a.m. silence, intimate and terrifying. We stood on the edge of her balcony, the city of Seattle reduced to a grid of amber streetlights below us. I had spent 5 years building a fortress of anonymity, convinced that my life as a dispatcher made me a ghost, a voice without a body, guiding strangers through crises while remaining untouched. But as Leah leaned against the railing, the humidity of the night clinging to her skin, I realized my privacy was a glass house. She hadn't just been living next door. She had been studying the same darkness I was hiding in. To understand why her gaze felt like a physical touch, you have to understand the architecture of my days. I work in a windowless room illuminated by the cool blue glow of 6 monitors. My life is measured in seconds and codes. 10:33, emergency traffic. Keep the voice steady, keep the breathing even. I am the calm center of a hurricane that never ends. When you spend 12 hours a day listening to the worst moments of people's lives, you learn to box your own emotions into tight, airless containers. You become an expert in compartmentalization. Precision is not just a job requirement, it is a survival mechanism. If I feel, I falter. And in my line of work, faltering costs lives. So, my apartment was designed as the antithesis of the call center. No screens, no sudden noises, just clean lines, monochromatic furniture, and silence so thick you could wrap yourself in it. It was a sanctuary of control. I needed the emptiness to decompress, to scrub the panic of strangers from my mind before I could sleep. I didn't want neighbors. I didn't want borrow a cup of sugar interactions. I wanted to be left alone in my meticulously curated void. Then Leah arrived. I didn't see her move in, but I felt the shift in the building's atmosphere. It was a subtle disruption, like a change in barometric pressure before a storm. The hallway on the 4th floor, usually sterile and smelling of industrial carpet cleaner, suddenly carried a faint trace of lavender and rain. It was intrusive. It was compelling. We shared the vampire shift, that specific, lonely slice of time between 3 a.m. and dawn when the rest of the world is paralyzed by sleep. I would hear her key turn in the lock of 4B just as I was unlacing my boots in 4A. The rhythm of it was seductive in its consistency. Click, turn, the heavy thud of a door closing. We were 2 satellites orbiting the same dead planet, active only when the sun was gone. I finally saw her a week later. My kitchen window looks across a small, decorative courtyard into her living space. I was standing in the dark, drinking water, trying to wash the taste of a particularly bad domestic disturbance call out of my mouth. Across the void, a lamp clicked on. She was wearing navy blue scrubs that hung loose on her frame, the fabric pulling against the curve of her hip as she moved. She looked exhausted, that bone-deep weariness that settles in the shoulders after 12 hours of holding other people's pain. She was a nurse. The ID badge still clipped to her pocket gave it away, catching the light as she tossed her keys onto a table. I watched her pull the hair tie from her messy bun, shaking out dark waves that fell around her face like a curtain. It was a violation of my own rules. I should have turned away. I should have respected the unspoken treaty of urban anonymity. But I couldn't. There was a raw, unfiltered honesty in the way she moved. She wasn't performing for anyone. She slumped onto her sofa, burying her face in her hands for a long, still moment. I knew that posture. I knew the specific weight of the silence she was trying to endure. I found myself standing there for minutes, water glass forgotten in my hand, just breathing in the sight of her. It wasn't just curiosity. It was a hunger I hadn't realized I was starving for. My life was precision and distance. Hers, even from across the courtyard, looked warm and messy and alive. She had plants crowding the windowsill, a stark contrast to my empty ledges. She had a throw blanket tangled on the floor. The internal conflict was immediate and sharp. My instinct was to barricade the door, to double-check the locks on my emotional fortress. But my eyes kept drifting back to her window. I started timing my kitchen visits to her arrival. I told myself it was just observation, a professional habit of monitoring the environment. But deep down, I knew it was the first crack in the wall. I was watching for her light because, for the first time in years, The darkness of my own apartment felt too cold to bear alone. The wall separating my bedroom from hers was a structural lie. It was drywall and insulation, perhaps 6 inches of matter designed to offer the illusion of solitude. But in the quiet hours of the afternoon, it became a membrane. I learned that intimacy isn't always about touch. Sometimes it is simply about the shared frequency of existence. When you live on a vampire schedule, the rest of the world becomes a distant, buzzing abstract. But the person sharing your silence becomes amplified. I would lie in bed at 2 p.m., staring at the ceiling, fighting the daylight bleeding around the edges of my blackout curtains. That was when I would hear it, the sudden hydraulic hiss of her shower turning on. It wasn't just a noise, it was a narrative. I could hear the initial burst of water against the fiberglass tub, the squeak of the handle turning, and then the softer, rhythmic drumming as she stepped into the spray. In the dark of my room, my mind would betray me. I wasn't just hearing plumbing. I was visualizing the steam rising, the way the hot water would sluice the exhaustion from her skin, the relaxation of those tense shoulders I had watched from across the courtyard. It felt voyeuristic, yet I couldn't stop listening. The sound was a tether. It was the only thing anchoring me to humanity, while the rest of the city worked and hustled outside. Her life leaked into mine in other ways. While I treated my apartment like a sensory deprivation tank, Leah lived out loud. She played music low, a heavy, thrumming bass that vibrated through my headboard. It wasn't annoying, it was hypnotic. It felt like a heartbeat that wasn't mine, syncing my pulse to a rhythm I hadn't chosen. I found myself waiting for it, pressing my hand against the cool plaster of the wall just to feel the faint tremor of her bass line. It was a pathetic gesture, I knew, a dispatcher reaching out for a signal she wasn't supposed to answer. But the precision of my control was eroding. I began to notice the stark difference in how we survived our solitude. On the rare days I was awake when the sun was high, I would peek through the sliver of my curtains. Leah would be on her balcony, fearless in the light. She would sit cross-legged on a cushion, wearing oversized t-shirts, drinking coffee, and letting the sun hit her face. She absorbed the world. I hid from it. Watching her unashamed existence made me feel small, tight, and suffocatingly disciplined. This fascination terrified me. I had dated men, safe, sturdy relationships that felt like well-executed contracts. There was a logic to them, a predictable sequence of dinner, conversation, and friction that I could navigate with my eyes closed. I understood the mechanics of attraction with men. It was a language I spoke fluently, but felt nothing when speaking. But this pull toward the woman next door was a foreign dialect. It was a gravity that didn't ask for permission. I would catch myself wondering if her skin felt as warm as it looked, or if her voice, which I had never heard, had the same texture as the jazz records she played. The thought of a woman, specifically this woman, disrupting my carefully calibrated equilibrium sent a spike of adrenaline through me that rivaled a 10:33 call. The proximity became a physical weight. I remember one Tuesday, the kind of gray, drizzling afternoon that makes the air feel heavy. I went down to the mailboxes, looking a wreck in sweatpants and a hoodie, my hair a disaster of sleepless tossing. I had my key in the small metal lock when the lobby door opened. The air pressure changed instantly. I didn't need to look to know it was her. The atmosphere charged, thickening with a sudden electric tension. I froze, my hand trembling slightly on the brass key. I could hear her breathing, slightly labored from the rain, the squeak of her sneakers on the tile. Panic, sharp and irrational, clawed at my throat. I wasn't ready to be seen. Not like this. Not when I felt so exposed by my own private thoughts. I grabbed my mail and fled toward the stairwell, keeping my head down, avoiding the elevator, just to escape the possibility of her gaze. I heard her pause, the jingle of her keys suspended in the silence as I bolted. Back in my apartment, I leaned against the door, heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. It was ridiculous. I was a professional who managed life and death crises without blinking, yet the mere possibility of saying hello to my neighbor left me shaking. I slid down the door until I hit the floor, clutching a stack of meaningless bills. The distance between 4A and 4B was only a hallway, but it felt like a precipice I was terrified to jump from, yet desperate to fall into. The insomnia that night was brutal. A wide-awake fever dream where every creak of the building sounded like an invitation I was too cowardly to accept. The inevitability of our collision was a mathematical certainty. In a building of 200 souls, only 2 of us were consistently returning to the hive at 5:45 a.m., dragging the weight of the city's nocturnal disasters behind us like a bridal train of wreckage. It happened on a Thursday, the morning after a shift so brutal it had left my hands feeling like they didn't quite belong to my body. I stepped into the elevator, pressing the button for the 4th floor with a finger that wouldn't stop vibrating. The doors began to slide shut, sealing me into the metal confession booth, when a hand thrust through the gap. The safety sensors tripped, the doors recoiled, and Leah stepped in. The space inside that elevator was perhaps 6 feet by 6 feet, but the moment she entered, the dimensions seemed to collapse. The air, previously stale and smelling of floor wax, was instantly rewritten. She brought the outside in with her, the damp, metallic scent of heavy rain on wool, layered over the sharp chemical bite of hospital antiseptic. Underneath that clinical top note, there was something else, something warmer and more dangerous, a faint trace of sleep-warm skin and coffee. It was a sensory assault that made my breath hitch in my throat. I stared rigidly at the brushed steel panel, counting the illuminated numbers as if they were a lifeline. 1, 2. You're going to crack a molar if you clamp down any harder. Her voice was not what I expected. I had imagined something brisk and professional, a nurse's efficient soprano. Instead, it was low, raspy, and textured like rough velvet. A voice that sounded like it had been smoking cigarettes or whispering secrets for 1,000 years. It vibrated in the small space, sliding under my defenses before I could reinforce them. I turned to look at her, the movement stiff and defensive. She wasn't looking at the numbers. She was leaning against the back rail, her head tilted, studying my profile with an intensity that felt like a tactile inspection. Her eyes were dark, a deep, unflinching brown that didn't apologize for staring. In the harsh, unforgiving light of the elevator, I saw the fine lines of exhaustion fanning out from them, the slight smudge of mascara beneath her lower lashes. She looked wrecked, beautiful, and entirely unbothered by the proximity. I don't grind my teeth, I lied, my voice sounding thin and brittle in my own ears. You do, she countered softly. You've been clenching your jaw since the lobby. I could see the muscle jumping from 10 feet away. She shifted her weight, the rustle of her coat sounding impossibly loud in the silence. Rough night on the headset? The question stripped away the pretense of anonymity. She knew. Of course she knew. Is it that obvious? Takes one to know one, she murmured. You have the voice of God posture, rigid, controlled, holding the ceiling up with your shoulders, but your eyes look like you just watched the world end. You're the dispatcher. And you're the nurse, I replied, my gaze dropping to the ID badge she had forgotten to remove. Trauma unit? ICU, she corrected. Tonight was heavy. We lost a 19-year-old at 3 a.m. I've been carrying that silence around for 3 hours. The elevator shuddered as it passed the 3rd floor, a mechanical hiccup that made the lights flicker. In that brief fluctuation of power, the air between us charged. It wasn't just the shared exhaustion. It was the recognition of a shared frequency. We were both custodians of other people's worst moments. We spent our nights managing chaos, boxing up screams and blood into reportable data, only to come home and try to be human beings in the quiet. The empathy radiating from her was palpable, a physical heat that pressed against my side. I reached out to steady myself against the handrail, and that's when the tremor betrayed me. It was a residual aftershock from a call involving a house fire and a trapped child, the adrenaline dump that hadn't fully cleared my system. My hand shook violently, a distinct rhythmic spasm that I couldn't suppress. I tried to pull it back, to hide the weakness in the pocket of my coat, but Leah was faster. She didn't reach for me. She didn't cross that final physical boundary. But her gaze dropped to my hand and held it there. It wasn't a look of pity. It was a look of clinical, intimate understanding. She watched the tremor with a focus that felt like she was mapping the nerve pathways, decoding the trauma stored in the muscle memory. The shake means you're still fighting it, she said, her voice dropping another octave, becoming a whisper that seemed to echo inside my chest. Let it go. You're off the clock. You don't have to be the one who holds it together anymore. For a terrifying second, I thought I might cry. The precision I prided myself on, the walls I had built, felt paper thin under the weight of her permission. The elevator chimed, a cheerful, incongruous sound that shattered the moment. The doors slid open on the 4th floor, revealing the empty, safe hallway. Leah didn't move immediately. She held my gaze for 1 second longer, her brown eyes searching mine, finding the terrified woman hiding behind the dispatcher's mask. "Get some sleep, neighbor," she whispered. She stepped out first, the scent of rain and antiseptic trailing behind her like a ghost. I stood alone in the metal box as the doors tried to close again, my hands still trembling, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I had survived the night, but I wasn't sure I would survive her. It took exactly 1 week for the universe to call my bluff. I had spent 7 days performing evasive maneuvers in the hallway, listening for her door before opening mine, living like a spy in my own building. But hunger is a primal thing, and at 3:15 a.m. on a Tuesday, my refrigerator was a barren wasteland of expired condiments and good intentions. The diner is 3 blocks away. It's a place of fluorescent purgatory, where time goes to die, smelling of stale coffee and fryer grease. I was huddled in the back booth, nursing a black coffee and staring at the rain streaking the window, when the reflection in the glass changed. I didn't hear her approach. Nurses move like ghosts when they want to. But suddenly, the red vinyl bench opposite me dipped. "You look like you're hiding," Leah said. No preamble, no, "Is the seat taken?" Just a direct line to the truth. I looked up. She was out of scrubs tonight, wearing a soft, oversized gray sweater that slipped off one shoulder. Her hair was down, damp from the rain, curling wildly around her face. In the harsh diner light, she looked less like a neighbor and more like a trouble I wasn't equipped to handle. "I'm decompressing," I deflected, wrapping my hands tighter around the ceramic mug. "It's different, is it?" She signaled the waitress for a coffee without looking away from me. "Because from here, it looks like you're building a fortress out of sugar packets and silence." I looked down. I had, unconsciously, lined up 5 sugar packets in a perfect, military straight row on the Formica table. I swept them aside, irritated by my own transparency. "Do you always analyze people before they've had their caffeine?" "Only the ones who look like they're vibrating," she countered, her voice dropping to that low, smoky register that made the hair on my arm stand up. "I've been listening to you, you know." My heart skipped a beat, a traitorous little flutter. "Listening?" "Through the wall, I hear you pacing, back and forth. 3 a.m., 4 a.m., you walk like you're trying to outrun something inside your own apartment." The accusation hung in the air, heavy and intimate. With men, the conversations were always about the surface. "How was your day? What do you want for dinner? Did you see the game?" Safe. Boring. With Leah, every sentence felt like she was peeling back a layer of skin. "I have insomnia," I said stiffly. "It comes with the badge." "It comes with the fear," she corrected gently. Her coffee arrived, steam curling between us. She took a sip, her eyes never leaving mine. "You spend all night controlling chaos for other people. I think you're terrified of what happens when the headset comes off and you can't control what you feel." I opened my mouth to argue, to retreat into my professional persona, but the words died in my throat. She was right. And the fact that she saw it, saw me, was terrifying. This was the first time feeling I hadn't been able to name. I had never let a partner see the messy, terrified creature beneath the dispatcher's armor. I kept men at arm's length, letting them touch my body, but never my silence. Leah was touching the silence without even lifting a finger. "What do you want, Leah?" The question came out whisper quiet, stripped of its edge. "I want to know if you ever let anyone in," she said. She reached across the table. It was a slow, deliberate movement. Her hand covered mine where it clenched the mug. The contact was electric. It wasn't a spark, it was a current. A steady, humming heat that shot straight up my arm and settled heavy in my chest. Her skin was warm, her fingers strong. She didn't grab, she just rested her hand there, a grounding weight against my trembling tension. Her thumb brushed the inside of my wrist, right over the pulse point that was hammering a frantic rhythm against my skin. "Your heart is racing," she murmured, her eyes dropping to where our skin touched, then back up to my face. The look she gave me was unguarded, hungry, and terrifyingly soft. You don't have to be made of steel all the time. It's okay to be soft. It's okay to want. The air in the diner seemed to vanish. The clatter of silverware, the hum of the refrigerator, the rain, it all fell away. There was just the heat of her hand and the terrifying realization that I wanted to turn my hand over and interlace our fingers. I wanted to lean across the table and breathe her in. I wanted to surrender, and that terrified me more than any 911 call ever could. Surrender meant loss of control. Surrender meant opening the door to a room I had kept locked for a decade. I pulled my hand back as if I'd been burned. The loss of her touch was an immediate physical ache. I have to go, I stammered, sliding out of the booth, fumbling for cash to throw on the table. I need to sleep. You can't sleep, she called after me, her voice soft but carrying that maddening confidence. That's the problem. I didn't look back. I walked out into the rain, the cool water doing nothing to douse the fire she had lit under my skin. Walking away didn't feel like an escape. It felt like a retreat. It felt like I had just lost a battle I didn't even know I was fighting. After the diner, I initiated full lockdown protocols. I became a ghost in my own building. I stopped taking the elevator entirely, choosing to trudge up 4 flights of concrete stairs at dawn just to avoid the possibility of that silver door opening and revealing her. I parked my car on the street instead of the garage, adding 10 minutes to my commute, just so our paths wouldn't cross in the underground silence. I was treating attraction like a hazardous material spill. Contain, isolate, neutralize. It was exhausting work, this denial. It required constant vigilance. Every time I heard a door slam, my pulse would spike. Every time the elevator chimed, I held my breath. I told myself I was protecting my peace, but deep down, I knew I was protecting my cowardice. I thought about the men I had dated, Jason, Mark, David. They were good men, solid, predictable. Being with them was like watching a movie I had seen a dozen times, comfortable, but I never leaned forward in my seat. I let them hold me, but I never let them hold me. I kept the core of myself locked away in a black box, just like the flight recorders on the planes I watched traverse the night sky. They were satisfied with the surface. Leah wasn't. Leah wanted the black box. The wall between us became an instrument of torture. I lay in bed during the day, staring at the plaster, knowing she was just inches away on the other side. The silence had changed. It wasn't empty anymore. It was heavy with her presence. Then, 3 days into my self-imposed exile, the frequency shifted again. It was 2 p.m. on a Thursday. The building was quiet, the hum of the city muffled by the rain. I was drifting in that gray space between sleep and wakefulness when I heard it. A sound so soft I almost missed it, but so sharp it cut through my defenses like a scalpel. Crying. Not the loud, dramatic sobbing of a movie, but the jagged, stifled gasps of someone trying desperately to be quiet. It was coming from her bedroom. Through the drywall, I could hear the creak of her bed frame, the muffled sound of a face pressed into a pillow. My dispatcher training kicked in instantly. Assess the situation. Identify the threat. But there was no protocol for this. There was no script for the woman who terrifies and fascinates you is falling apart 6 inches from your head. I lay there, frozen, my hand pressed flat against the cool wall. I could feel the vibrations of her distress. It was visceral. Every sob felt like it was happening in my own chest. I knew, logically, it was probably the job. The ICU, the 19-year-old they lost, the accumulation of grief that nurses carry in their bones until it spills over. But knowing didn't stop the ache. I wanted to knock on the wall. I wanted to go over there. I wanted to do the one thing I had spent my entire adult life avoiding. I wanted to cross the line. I wrestled with it for an hour. The crying eventually stopped, replaced by a heavy, exhausted silence that was somehow worse. I got up. I paced my kitchen. I looked at the kettle. The gesture was small, almost pathetic in its safety. I brewed a blend of chamomile and valerian, the heavy-duty stuff I used when the ghosts of bad calls kept me awake. I found a small box of shortbread cookies I had been saving. I wrote a note on a plain white index card. No name, Just 3 words. For the quiet. I waited until I was sure she was asleep. Or hoped she was. I opened my door with the care of a bomb disposal technician. The hallway was empty. I tiptoed the 5 feet to her door, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I placed the small care package on her welcome mat, a ridiculous thing with a cartoon cat on it that clashed with everything I knew about her intensity. I was straightening up, ready to retreat to my bunker, when the lock clicked. I froze. There was no time to run. The door swung open. Leah stood there. She looked wrecked. Her eyes were red-rimmed and swollen, her hair a tangled mess, wearing an oversized t-shirt that hung off one shoulder. She looked raw, vulnerable, and completely beautiful. She looked down at the tea and cookies on the mat, then up at me. There was no surprise in her face, just a deep, weary recognition. She didn't say a word. She didn't have to. The air between us thickened, charged with everything we weren't saying. She knew I had heard her. She knew I had been listening. And she knew that despite my running, despite the stares and the avoidance, I was still right here. I felt stripped bare. My anonymous gesture was a confession. I opened my mouth to explain, to apologize, to invent an excuse about extra tea bags, but nothing came out. Leah just looked at me, her dark eyes holding mine, and for a second, the sadness in them cleared, replaced by something softer. A gratitude that felt like a physical touch. "Thank you," she whispered. The sound was rough, broken. I nodded, unable to speak, and stepped back into the safety of my apartment, closing the door between us. But as the latch clicked, I knew the truth. The wall was still there, but the denial was gone. I wasn't just a neighbor anymore. I was involved, and there was no turning back from that. They tell you during training that you are a conduit, not a container. You are supposed to let the voices pass through you. Information in, resources out, clear the line. But some nights, the city is too heavy to pass through. Some nights, the voices stick to your ribs like tar. It happened on a Tuesday, 3 weeks after the tea incident. The call came in at 3:42 a.m. It wasn't a scream. Screams are easy. Screams are adrenaline. This was a whisper. A woman hiding in a closet while someone prowled through her house with heavy boots. I stayed on the line with her for 12 minutes. I heard her breathing hitch. I heard the door handle turn. And then I heard the phone drop, followed by a silence so absolute it felt like the end of the world. I waited for the officers to clear the scene, staring at my monitor, willing a voice to come back. It didn't. The update code flashed across my screen. 10:52. Medical examiner requested. I didn't log off. I fled. The drive home is a blur of rain-slicked asphalt and red taillights that looked like bleeding wounds in the dark. I wasn't driving. The car was guiding itself while I sat in the driver's seat, vibrating. My hands were gripping the wheel so hard my knuckles were white, but I couldn't feel them. The box I put my emotions in had been crushed. The precision was gone. I was just a woman who had listened to another woman die, and the silence was still ringing in my ears, louder than the engine, louder than the rain. I made it to the 4th floor, but I couldn't make it inside. I stood in front of door 4A, my sanctuary, fumbling with my keys. My hands were shaking so violently that the metal refused to find the slot. Clack, miss. Clack, miss. The sound was a jagged rhythm in the quiet hallway. I leaned my forehead against the cold wood of my door, gasping for air that wouldn't fill my lungs. I was hyperventilating, the edges of my vision fraying into gray static. I was going to fall apart right here on the industrial carpet, completely alone. Then the air changed. The door behind me opened. I didn't turn around. I couldn't. I didn't want her to see me like this, broken, unprofessional, messy. But I felt her presence. It was a wave of warmth hitting my frozen back. Hey, it wasn't a question. It wasn't a greeting. It was an anchor. I turned slowly. Leah stood in the doorway of 4B. She was wearing a silk robe that looked like a watercolor painting of a storm, tied loosely at the waist. She took one look at me, at the keys trembling in my hand, at the tear tracks I hadn't realized were there, at the way I was holding myself together by sheer, brittle will. And she didn't ask what happened. She didn't offer a platitude. "Leave the keys," she said, her voice low and steady. Come inside. I can't, I choked out, the words scraping my throat. I need to decompress. You need to breathe, she corrected. She stepped into the hallway, closing the distance between us. She didn't touch me, not yet, but she reached out and gently took the keys from my shaking fingers. She slipped them into her pocket. Come on, my place. Now. It wasn't a request. It was an instruction, delivered with the absolute authority of a triage nurse who knows exactly who needs saving. And God help me, I followed her. Crossing the threshold into Leah's apartment was like stepping onto a different planet. My apartment is a study in minimalism. Gray walls, black furniture, empty surfaces. Leah's apartment was a jungle. It was alive. The air was thick and humid, smelling of damp earth, crushed basil, and something floral and heavy, like jasmine. There were plants everywhere. Vines trailing from the tops of bookshelves, ferns exploding from ceramic pots on the floor, a massive monstera dominating the corner like a green guardian. It was chaotic and cluttered and overwhelmingly warm. Books were stacked in precarious towers on the floor. A turntable sat on the sideboard, surrounded by vinyl. It felt like walking into the inside of someone's heart. Messy, vibrant, and beating. Sit, she commanded softly, pointing to a velvet sofa the color of crushed berries. I sank into it. It was soft, swallowing me up. Leah moved to the kitchen, her movements efficient and fluid. I watched her fill a kettle, the domestic normalcy of it clashing violently with the horror still looping in my head. I was shivering, a deep, bone-rattling cold that had nothing to do with the temperature. She returned with a heavy wool blanket. She didn't just hand it to me. She tucked it around my shoulders, her hands lingering for a moment on my arms, testing the tension in my muscles. Chamomile and valerian, she said, placing a steaming mug in my hands. I took your advice. It's good for the quiet. I looked up at her, clutching the mug like a lifeline. She was crouching in front of me, eye level, her knees pressing into the rug. Her robe had fallen open slightly, revealing the curve of her collarbone, warm and golden in the low light. I lost her, I whispered. The confession fell out of me before I could stop it. I was on the line, and the silence, it just took everything. Leah didn't flinch. She didn't look away. She reached out and covered my hands with hers, her palms hot against my cold skin. I know, she said, her voice rough with empathy. I know the silence. But you're not on the line anymore. You're here. You're safe. Look at me. I looked. And in the gold-flecked depths of her eyes, I saw the only thing that could push back the dark. My defenses, built over 5 years of tragedy, didn't just crack. They dissolved. For the first time, I wasn't the voice in the dark. I was the one being listened to. We sat there until the darkness began to dilute, the sky bruising into a deep, heavy purple. The tea was gone, but the warmth of the mug still lingered in my palms. The silence in the room had shifted again. It was no longer the desperate, gasping quiet of a crisis, but something settled and waiting. Leah stood up, the movement fluid and silent, and slid the glass door to the balcony open. The sound of the city waking up drifted in, the distant hum of traffic on the interstate, the hiss of a bus air brake, the specific, lonely sound of wet tires on asphalt. Come here, she said, stepping out into the cool, gray air. I followed her, wrapping the blanket tighter around my shoulders. Stepping onto her balcony felt like stepping onto the bridge of a ship. We were high enough that the streetlights were amber stars below us, flickering out as the dawn gained strength. The air was thick with the smell of rain and ozone, a sharp contrast to the warm, jasmine-scented humidity of her living room. I looked across the narrow gap of the courtyard to my own apartment. From this angle, it looked foreign. The windows of 4A were black, lifeless squares. The blinds were drawn tight, sealing the interior off from the world. It looked like a vault. It looked like a place where someone went to disappear. I shouldn't have come here, I murmured, the shame of my earlier breakdown finally catching up to me. I was a professional. I was the one who handled the panic, not the one who brought it to someone's doorstep at 4 a.m. I'm sorry, I didn't know where else to go. Leah turned to me. She was leaning back against the railing, her elbows resting on the wet metal, the silk of her robe fluttering slightly in the wind. The dawn light washed her in shades of gray and silver, making the fatigue under her eyes look like bruises. But her gaze was steady. "Stop apologizing for being human," she said, her voice low. "You spend your life listening to the worst moments of other people's lives. Did you really think you could just swallow all that darkness without eventually needing to spit it out?" "I usually manage," I said defensively, looking back at my dark windows. "I have a system. Precision. Control. Tonight was just a glitch." "It wasn't a glitch. It was a breakthrough." She pushed off the railing and moved to stand beside me. She was close enough that I could feel the heat radiating from her body, a tangible force against the chill of the morning. She turned her head, following my gaze to my apartment. "You think you're invisible over there," she said softly. "You think because you pull the blinds and turn off the lights, no one knows you're in there. You think you're a ghost." "I am a ghost," I countered. "That's the job." "No," Leah whispered. She raised a hand, pointing across the gap to my living room window. "I can see everything from here." The line hung in the air, heavy and vibrating. I looked at her, startled. "What do you mean? The blinds are closed." "I don't mean the furniture," she said, her dark eyes locking onto mine. "I mean you. I see the blue light of your TV flickering at 3 a.m. when you can't sleep. I see the shadow of you pacing back and forth like a caged animal. I see the way you stand at the window for hours, just watching the rain, terrified to step out into it." She took a half step closer, eliminating the personal space I had tried so hard to maintain. "I see the loneliness, neighbor. It radiates off that apartment like heat. I've been watching you build that fortress for months, brick by brick. And tonight, when you stood in the hallway shaking, it wasn't the first time I saw you breaking. It was just the first time you let me see it." The air between us seemed to snap tight. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. My privacy was an illusion. My carefully constructed glass house wasn't just transparent. It was a display case. She hadn't just been the neighbor I was obsessed with. She had been the witness to my own unraveling. My heart hammered against my ribs, not from fear, but from a sudden, dizzying vertigo. To be seen, truly seen, was terrifying. It stripped away the dispatcher's armor, the voice of God detachment, leaving only the woman underneath. "You watched me," I whispered. "I couldn't look away," she admitted, her voice dropping to a husk. "Just like you couldn't look away from me." The tension peaked. A high, singing wire stretched between us. The city below us was waking up, the world starting its noisy, chaotic day. But up here, on this concrete precipice, time had stopped. I looked at her, the mess of her dark hair, the unflinching honesty of her eyes, the softness of her mouth. And I realized I was standing on the edge of something I couldn't control. "Leah," I said, my voice trembling, I don't know how to do this." "Do what?" "This," I gestured vaguely between us, my hand shaking. I've never let a woman this close. I've never let anyone this close. I don't know the protocol." "Screw the protocol," she whispered. The confession hung in the dawn air, raw and terrified, waiting for her to either dismiss it or catch it. She didn't blink. She just watched me, her gaze shifting from my eyes to my lips, and the gravity between us finally became undeniable. She didn't flinch. Most people, when faced with a confession of inexperience or fear, instinctively take a half step back to give you air. They offer reassurance, a nervous laugh, or a polite exit strategy. Leah did none of those things. She stood her ground, her presence solid and unmoving against the dawn wind. She didn't offer me a safety net of words because she knew that wasn't what I needed. I didn't need to be told it was okay. I needed to be shown that the world wouldn't end if I let go. The distance between us was measured in inches, but it felt like miles of terrifying, uncharted territory. Leah closed it. She stepped into my personal space, deliberate and slow, a calculated invasion that felt less like a threat and more like permission. The air between us compressed, thick with the scent of ozone and the heat radiating from her skin. It was a physical weight, heavier than the humidity, heavier than the exhaustion dragging at my bones. I could see the individual gold flecks in her brown eyes, catching the first gray light of morning, tiny, burning stars in a dark sky that I had been studying from a distance for weeks. She raised her hand. I stopped breathing. My instinct, honed by years of keeping the world at arm's length, was to flinch, to retreat behind the glass wall of my professionalism. But I was frozen, pinned in place by the gravity of her gaze. Her palm settled against my jaw, her skin shockingly warm against my cold cheek. It wasn't a tentative touch. It was firm, claiming. Her thumb traced the line of my jaw, finding the knot of tension I had carried there since my first shift on the headset 5 years ago. She pressed into it, a nurse's touch, knowing exactly where the pain lived and refusing to look away from it. "Breathe," she commanded, a whisper that vibrated against my skin. And just like that, the architecture of my control collapsed. The dispatcher, that cool, detached entity who managed crises by boxing them up, disintegrated. There was no code for this. There was no protocol for the way her thumb brushed the corner of my mouth, or the way my heart hammered a frantic, irregular rhythm that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with want. The precision I worshipped, the clean lines and the silence, it all felt suddenly sterile and dead compared to the chaotic, terrifying heat of her hand on my face. I realized with a jolt that I wasn't afraid of her. I was afraid of how much I wanted to surrender. I closed my eyes, cutting the wire on the last of my defenses. I leaned into her touch, a silent admission of defeat that felt like a victory. Then, she kissed me. It wasn't the frantic, movie script crash of passion I had seen 1,000 times. It was slow. It was deep. It was a question asked and answered in the same breath. Her lips were soft, tasting faintly of the chamomile tea and the salt of the tears I had shed earlier. There was an exhaustion in it, yes. We were both wreckage from the night shift. But underneath that was a current of electricity that scorched through me. It grounded me. It pulled me out of the high-rise, out of the headset, out of the voice in the dark, and slammed me back into my own body. For the first time in my life, the silence in my head wasn't empty. It was full of her. The kiss deepened, her other hand coming up to tangle in the hair at the nape of my neck, pulling me closer until there was no air left between us, only the friction of silk and skin. It felt like coming home to a house I didn't know I owned. The terror dissolved, replaced by a relief so profound it made my knees weak. I wasn't floating anymore. I was here. I was real. When she finally pulled back, resting her forehead against mine, we were both breathless. The city below had fully woken up, the noise of traffic rising to meet us, but it sounded distant, irrelevant. Leah ran her thumb over my lower lip, her eyes searching mine, finding the new truth written there. "Let's go inside," she murmured, her voice rough, "before the sun ruins the mood." I nodded, unable to speak, and let her lead me back through the glass door, leaving the cold, precise world behind for the warm, messy sanctuary of her room. I woke up to the sound of rain against glass. But for the first time in 5 years, the silence of the morning wasn't heavy. It was shared. We were tangled together on her velvet sofa, limbs heavy with sleep, fully clothed but intimately bound in a way that felt more scandalous than nakedness. My head was resting on her stomach, rising and falling with her breath, a living, breathing rhythm that beat out the frantic, ticking clock I had lived by for a decade. The panic of the night before, the shaking hands, the hyperventilation, the crushing weight of the dead silence on the line, had evaporated. In its place was a clarity that felt terrifyingly bright. I lay there, tracing the intricate pattern of the throw blanket, realizing with a jolt that the world hadn't ended because I lost control. The sky hadn't fallen. The 911 lines hadn't ceased to ring. The only thing that had shattered was the glass cage I'd built around myself. Leah stirred, her hand drifting instinctively to my hair, her fingers tangling in the mess of it. "You're thinking too loud," she murmured, her voice thick with sleep and rougher than usual. "I can hear the gears turning from here." I shifted, sitting up slowly, feeling the stiffness in my neck from the awkward angle. The room was washed in the gray, diffused light of a rainy Seattle morning. "I'm trying to figure out the logistics," I admitted, pulling my knees to my chest, sudden insecurity washing over me. The night shifts, the proximity, the fact that I have no idea what I'm doing. I feel like I'm trying to defuse a bomb without a manual. Leah opened one eye, a slow, lazy smile spreading across her face. You treat intimacy like a tactical operation. Assess the threat, secure the perimeter. She sat up, stretching, her silk robe slipping to reveal the warm curve of her shoulder. This isn't a crisis, neighbor. It's just breakfast. We moved to the kitchen. It was a dance of domesticity that should have felt foreign, but felt strangely inevitable. I watched her make coffee, dark, strong, unpretentious, while I found eggs in her chaotic fridge. There was a comfort in the silence now, a frequency we had tuned into together. As the smell of toast and coffee filled the humid, plant-filled air, I looked at her. Really looked at her. I'm 32, I said quietly, leaning against her counter, watching the steam rise from the mug. And I feel like I'm reading the manual for the first time. It feels late, like a mistake I'm trying to correct. I've spent so long being rigid, I don't know if I can be soft. Leah stopped stirring. She moved into my space, her presence a warm front colliding with my cool reserve. It's not a mistake, she said, her voice dropping to that low, sultry register that made my breath hitch. It's a course correction. You were just waiting for a signal strong enough to break through the static. And trust me, the reception is perfectly clear from here. She kissed me then, a soft, coffee-flavored promise that sealed the argument. We ate sitting on her floor, surrounded by her jungle of plants, talking about everything and nothing. The terror of the first time dissolved into the simple reality of being known. Before I left, I looked out her window one last time. Across the courtyard, the windows of 4A stared back at me. Dark, sterile, and empty. It looked like a museum exhibit of a life, not a home. It was a shell I had outgrown in the span of 6 hours. I have to go back, I said, the words tasting like ash. I have a shift tonight. Go, Leah said, leaning against the doorframe, looking like a ruinous, beautiful storm. But leave the key to the fortress unlocked. I might want to visit. I walked across the hall to my door, the distance of 10 feet feeling like a canyon I had finally bridged. I unlocked my silent, perfect apartment, but as I stepped inside, I knew I wasn't really returning. I had left the essential part of myself, the part that beat and bled and felt, safely in the chaos of 4B. 2 weeks later, the divider between our balconies isn't a barrier anymore. It's a bridge. We sit there now as the sun goes down, watching the city lights flicker on like amber codes in the dark. My hand rests naturally in hers, her thumb tracing the pulse that finally beats a steady rhythm. I spent my entire life as a voice in the dark, directing strangers to safety, guiding them through their worst fires. But in the end, I wasn't the savior. Leah was the one listening to the frequency I didn't know I was broadcasting, and she was the one who guided me home. If you've ever found safety in the most unexpected place, subscribe for more stories like this.